our guest, Geoffrey Berman, author of Holding the Line, Inside the Nation's Preeminent U.S. Attorney's Office and its battle with the Trump Justice Department. We're going to talk a little bit about the main accusations in the book that Trump was trying to use the Justice Department like a kind of a personal law firm. But there's an awful lot to talk about with our guest, Geoffrey Berman. Welcome, not the least of which is this. I could have thrown a rock when I was growing up and hit Geoffrey Berman's house with it. We lived, 100 feet from each other.
That's right. That's right.
Now, Geoffrey, you're 2 years older than I am.
Right.
And you did not go, I went to Lawrence High School, which is the public school. You went to the better school.
No, I went to Lawrence High School for a couple years and then transferred to the school that your brother went to,
Lawrenceville Prep.
Yeah.
I think you were in his grade.
Yeah. We were together. He's a very smart guy.
I had the same problem with him. He was a very smart guy. I didn't care for that growing up.
Well, you got to accept it. And at this point, I think you can get over it.
You know what it was? He would come home with silver trophies for his Latin score. And I thought, well, this guy is so smart. I'm clearly going to have to go in a different direction. And I think it led me to where I am. Now, your older brother, Michael, how much older was Michael?
Michael's 2 years older than me.
Than you. And then your younger brother, Danny.
And Danny was 4 years younger than me and 2 years younger than you. And we were, right across the street. The Goldmans were in between us.
And the Litowitz was on the other side.
Litowitz, I once...
He was a judge.
I should say this. He was a judge, and I had I was practicing with golf clubs when I was a teenager, and you had the wiffle golf balls, right? And they weren't going anywhere. They were going like 5 feet.
Not fun to hit.
Without permission from my parents, I took out a real golf ball and I let it go, and it smashed the Litowitz's big plate window. I don't know if you remember that huge.
Sure, I remember it.
And so I did what any kid would do is I immediately ran in the house and hid. And the judge comes out. the judge comes out holding the ball, looking for who did it.
Yes.
And ultimately, I think my mother got involved, but it was tough.
The picture window at the Litowitz's house was the envy of the neighborhood. It was a large, luxurious picture window. What people don't understand is we lived in Little Haifa. There were these 4 Jewish families that all lived cat-a-corner from each other and then surrounded by basically Lawrence Township was mostly Italian, Irish.
It was blue collar.
African-American. And then there were these 4 Jewish families who lived in the Warsaw area of Lawrence Township. Judge Litowitz was obviously the superstar of the area.
Yeah, and then you just said the judge. You didn't have to say Litowitz. It was the judge.
He was the judge. And then everyone else was school teachers, I imagine. The Goldmans and my mother.
And my mother was a school teacher.
Was a school teacher as well. So we were all living in that area. But we didn't really see you because you went to that Lawrenceville Prep with my brother. And where did Danny go?
He went to Lawrenceville too.
He went to Lawrenceville too.
Yeah, neither of my brothers went into comedy. We all, went to Lawrenceville.
My mother makes it very clear. The Berman kids, all very successful.
Well, it's and your brother. So my older brother Michael is a big time publisher. He co-founded George Magazine. Daniel bought a bunch of radio and TV stations in the South, and he's very successful. And
he's the Rupert Murdoch of Southern. Whatever, the Confederacy.
Well, worse than that. and I know, Larry is extremely successful.
He did very well. I don't ask him what he does. He doesn't ask what I do. We just go over that.
My whole family, we were watching when you received the Mark Twain Award.
Yes.
And, because we wanted to see you, your whole family was there, and your mom was there.
My brother.
We just want to congratulate you on that.
Oh, thank you so much. This is our new Hanukkah podcast. We're just going to go over all the holidays. But I want to talk about what you're doing. The Southern District of New York is sort of a legendary, I guess, I don't know what they call attorney jurisdictions. It's a
district. It's a district of a state, and it's the Southern District of New York.
But why is the Southern District office considered so legendary? Is it because it's downstate and it's in Manhattan. So you have to deal with whether it be Cosa Nostra or these kind of terrorist cases.
That's exactly right. We're at the hub. Okay. We're at the foot of Wall Street.
All right.
No financial crimes can be really committed in the entire United States without some of the money running through Wall Street. So we've got jurisdiction over that. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, we have the history with the terrorism cases. So we have one of the finest national security units in the country.
Right.
Public corruption is not unheard of in New York. And
what?
So
in the Southern District of New York? How dare you, sir?
It goes on.
How dare you? How did you end up there? How do you end up prosecuting Mavi cases, terrorist cases in Southern District of New York? How did your law career move to that?
So I was hired to be a prosecutor on the Iran-Contra cases, which was that was extraordinary.
So you dealt with, for those who don't remember Iran-Contra, it was we sold missiles, I guess, to Iran, and then took that money and it was diverted to the Contras in Central America for their civil war.
That's right. And there was a congressional prohibition on the U.S. funding the Contras. Right. It was called the Boland Amendment. And the money that was funneled by Oliver North and others was in contravention of the Boland Amendment. So that's the first case I worked on.
Weren't we also prevented from selling arms to Iran at that point? Because this was post Islamic Revolution. The Shah was no longer in power. So this was the Ayatollah's regime. And I think America was not allowed to sell them weapons.
Well, this was a clandestine sale. I don't think it was necessarily illegal. Remember, at that point, I believe Iran and Iraq were in a long-term war together.
That's right.
And I think that, was probably in the interest of the United States that war continue, as long as possible.
The United States, big fan of continuing wars that they're not involved in, but send arms to. Now, you were, though, not to be too political, but you are a Republican, and so that was a Republican administration. That was, I believe, H.W. Bush, no? I mean, it was the Reagan administration.
It started under Reagan, and then George H.W. Bush won the election, and then when the charges ended up being brought, it was under George H.W. Bush. But, it was there I learned early on, it doesn't matter what your political affiliation is.
Right.
You do the job. You look at the facts, you look at the law, and you're unbiased. That's like the cardinal rule of the Department of Justice, and one that I learned very early on.
Did your parents know that growing up you were living that close to a communist? Did they have any idea what was happening just up the street?
No, the word never got out. And thank God the judge didn't find out.
If the judge had found out, I'm not sure I would have made it through, let alone that time I shot a BB gun through my mother's van window. But that's a whole other story. So you end up, you're in the Southern District, and I think the point you made about you learned early on that it didn't matter what your affiliation was, these things should not be politicized. Iran-Contra is another example of the difficulty. How long was the prosecution of that case? And ultimately, Oliver North was convicted, yes, but wasn't it only of perjury?
Well, it was also, interesting enough, with the news in the headlines today, it was obstruction as well. I worked very closely on the Oliver North obstruction case. Do you remember Fawn Hall?
Sure, I remember Fawn Hall. She was an assistant in that office, and ultimately ended up very glamorous, dating, I think, Rob Lowe or so. People don't remember the 80s in any way, and they shouldn't, because it was a nightmare. So she was a cooperating witness. How difficult was it to get the records that you had required from the administration, from Oliver North, from Fawn Hall? How did this case turn?
So on the obstruction part of the case, it was probably the most straightforward case, because this was at the very origins of email. And he was using an early email system of the U.S. government. And so he spent like a couple nights at his computer deleting emails, thinking, oh, well, they're deleted, they're gone.
Right. Didn't understand.
Well, nobody understood that. In fact, when it became public that the FBI was able to resurrect every email that he deleted,
Oh
people
my
were like
God.
amazed. And they're thinking, oh my God, when I deleted something, it's not really deleted? No, it's there forever, essentially.
So this gets us now to where you're at. Trump, all these administrations followed this same sort of pattern. There is a whiff of a corrupt, let's say it's a quid pro quo, let's say it's an underhanded dealing. We have to understand all governments, Republican, Democrat, there are ways in which they conduct business that are always tiptoeing on the line of what we would consider corruption. And the job of the prosecutor is always to go back and say, give us the records, let us look through. And invariably, the records are not given with any kind of alacrity. There is shenanigans. People try and delete them. They won't give you the phone. They delay. They deny. And it's very unusual that to gain a conviction in these cases, is it not?
Yeah, no, it's very hard. And you have to show a corrupt intent through the whole process. And we had a very hard time collecting documents in the Iran-Contra case because so many of them were classified. And it was very difficult.
So even in Iran-Contra, they were stored at Mar-a-Lago. Isn't that? I believe that's where our nation's secrets are now housed. It's the Fort Knox of American secrets.
But Fort Knox with a view.
Yes, beautiful, beautiful place.
In the Iran-Contra case, we were stymied because the administration wasn't letting us use the classified documents at trial because it's ultimately up to the discretion of the administration whether to declassify the documents for purposes of a trial. And so we had to drop a couple of prosecutions, one that I was intimately involved in because they wouldn't allow us to divulge the classified documents.
That's right. So generally, though, and this gets us to maybe the crux of the conversation. The thing that I think people are curious about is this, because I'm curious about it. America is, if there's one thing that we do well, it's incarcerate people. I mean, we are numero uno as far as jailing people per capita for any industrialized nation. Man, you got guys, they come in, they jump a turnstile, they're doing 4 months at Rikers in a terrible situation. But when it comes to political crime or white-collar crime, it seems that the advantage flips. That in general crime, the crimes of chaos or direct crime, the defendant is really, and maybe its resources, is behind. But when it comes to white-collar crime and when it comes to political crime, their strategy is delay, deny, don't give access, fight everything until the attorney at the Southern District gets pushed out. Or it seems that we are not necessarily well-equipped to prosecute these crimes.
Well, that's what's so extraordinary about the Southern District of New York. And it really is one of the country's great institutions. And I was right after Iran-Contra, I was an AUSA in the Southern District of New York in the early 90s and learned to do things, the Southern District way. And the reason the Southern District is so extraordinary is we are going toe-to-toe with the biggest, most formidable law firms in the country. And we take them on, and we're not afraid, and we have the talent.
And they could make a bunch of money doing corporate law, doing a lot of other stuff, retaining that. They've got to be dedicated.
They are completely dedicated. They could make a lot more money on the outside, but they don't because they love their job, and there's nothing more rewarding than public service. And we take it on, and we take it on really well.
And obviously you can see what they're up against, but then why does it take so long? Because let's use Trump as the example now. Listen, I'm from New York, so we've known the guy for 30 or 40 years. Everybody knows the type of guy he is. Any contractor that ever worked with him knew I'm going to get paid 80%, 75% of what I'm owed, just to the point where it's too expensive for me to try and claw it back in court. He's notorious for his abusive and kind of exploitative business dealings. But as far as the legalities of it, when you look at his lawyer, Michael Cohen, goes to jail, his CFO, Alan Weisselberg, goes to jail, how does this what does he do that allows everyone in his satellite orbit to be prosecuted for very clear crimes? How does he end up unscathed?
Well, look, in my book, I don't talk about investigations that the office undertook when we didn't indict, right? Because it violates department policy and it's not fair.
Right.
But what I can tell you is that after Cohen's guilty plea, the office investigated thoroughly the campaign finance violation charges. Actually, it's public that Weisselberg was granted immunity and put in a grand jury in the Southern District of New York. He made that public. And I can tell you that the Southern District doesn't pull punches. And if there was a case to be brought, the Southern District would have brought it. But what you have to do is you have to examine in a kind of granular way the evidence against somebody, look at the elements of the charge and be confident that, if the admissible evidence is put before a jury, that you're going to get a conviction that people are going to say guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. Right. That's a high standard. And, we don't have a different standard for, some people as opposed to other people. Everybody is treated the same.
Well, in some ways, though, they're not, because, he clearly has the resources to delay. Anybody else in that situation, and I'm not just talking about Trump, I'm talking about generally people of means and people who are politically connected. It's pretty clear that they make it much harder for folks like you to indict them, because in any other case, so imagine you're just dealing with regular Joe on the street. And let's say that regular Joe on the street pays off a adult film star not to talk based on...
It's a hypothetical.
It's a hypothetical. And the lawyer who executes that deal is found guilty. But the person at whose behest that lawyer is operating, the Southern District just says what are you going to do? You can't. You can't get that guy.
I don't think the Southern District of New York ever said that.
Right.
We had a dedicated team of our best prosecutors.
Right.
And they pursued those allegations thoroughly.
So was the idea there that Cohen acted on his own? Is that the thought?
That doesn't mean that's what happened. But when it comes to
that's only what you can prove.
When it comes to indicting, you have to look at the admissible evidence against a particular individual. And so we looked at the evidence against Michael Cohen, and it was there, and he pled guilty. And, no other prosecutions were brought because, there wasn't a case to be brought.
So even if Michael Cohen said, I will testify and say, Donald Trump told me to do that, that's not enough.
That's not the end of the analysis that's required to have a successful trial against someone else.
And same with the Alan Weisselberg case. He could say, Donald Trump told me to do this to make sure that my properties are inflated in value when I'm looking to leverage them for loans, and make sure they're deflated in value when I'm paying taxes. And even that, I guess that's my point, is what can we do to make political crime and white-collar crime of the big fish? There's so many tactics that they can do. The bar of prosecution for these people of means, let alone a former president, seems like it's so high as to not make a lot of sense. Because isn't it beyond your comprehension that Trump isn't the ringleader of the fraudulent case against the CFO Weisselberg and the case against Michael Cohen?
I just believe in the professionalism of prosecuting a case and building a case brick by brick and not letting other thoughts or, politics enter into it. And as far as, the Southern District just indicted the former lieutenant governor of New York, right? So Southern District is not afraid of taking on powerful people.
You know, I'm looking at the case now in Mar-a-Lago. When you're in a situation where you can get a case heard before a judge that you appointed and they don't have to recuse themselves, does that put prosecutors at a disadvantage? In other words, the disadvantages that prosecutors face in these cases versus the cases that they're looking to prosecute against people of less import or less means. What does a district attorney in that position, what are the tools that you can use to get the corroborating materials that you need? Because it's pretty clear they fight tooth and nail to keep you from the evidence.
So in this case with Mar-a-Lago, right, you know, the Justice Department just filed an appeal seeking immediate access to the classified documents that were seized in the search. And there's an urgency to what the Department of Justice wants, and that's to move forward with the investigation. And I get it. I mean, it was an incredible revelation when the Department of Justice announced that they were investigating Donald Trump and those around him, not just for the mishandling of classified information, but for obstruction of a subpoena requiring disclosure of those classified documents. That's a very, very important charge. I mean, if that were in the Southern District, we would be moving really quickly on it. It would have the highest priority. And here Merrick Garland is, and he can't move forward with the case as he wants because he can't have access to those seized documents. So I get why he wants to move forward. I understand the importance, and I think he's justified.
Now, again, like I guess I look at the bar of this. You know, I look at when he says I guess the archives call him and they say, "We want our documents back," and he says, "No, they're mine." And then they meet with his lawyers and they come up with a plan and they say, "There's no classified documents here, and we're going to give you this stuff. This is all of it." And then I guess they find out.
And it wasn't a meeting. They got a subpoena. You know, the people who receive it better be thorough and complete and take it seriously. And if they didn't, very, very serious charge.
But I would imagine that most people, regular Joes again, who get a subpoena don't get the kind of leeway that these politicians are getting. You know, subpoenas at this point, there's a lot of them that say, "I'm not sure I'm going to abide by it. I may. I'll think about it." A subpoena, in my mind, is not, "Hey, we'd love to talk to you someday."
No, it's not discretionary. It's a mandate, and nothing should focus the mind of anyone, powerful or not powerful, like receiving a subpoena.
But there seems to be a gap in accountability of receiving a subpoena where it now appears to be like getting a jury duty summons. Like you get a jury duty summons and you think like, well, I'll just go in there and tell them I have a job and everything will be fine. I think if you're the public, there's a real frustration that the rule of law doesn't necessarily apply equally.
No, I get it. And I saw it happen in my experience as U.S. Attorney in the Southern District when Trump, as you said, would use the Department of Justice like his own law firm and target political enemies and benefit his political friends. And that eviscerates the rule of law, and people then lose faith in the critical institutions in our country, like like the Department of Justice, like the FBI, like the judiciary, and it's awful. It's destroying the fabric of our country, and we really have to fix it.
What is that accountability piece? For instance, and I don't even understand this one, you've got Matt Gaetz, who is a congressman down in Florida. He's been apparently under investigation for 2 years for sex trafficking of a minor. He asked the president for a preemptive pardon. Is there a scenario there that makes sense to you as to why that's 2 years? And there seems to be, I mean, he's running again. He's going to win more than likely, I guess, because he's in a pretty safe seat. How do you unpack what goes wrong there?
Listen, you know the priority that I gave and that the Southern District had on sex trafficking cases, right? We're the ones who corrected the injustice of Epstein.
Right. Another example of someone with means who is caught red-handed in a thing, and the accountability piece isn't there. So what goes on?
You know, in the Southern District of New York, when there was an important case, we pursued it, and we pursued it nonstop. And there was never an instance where we were like somehow delayed by tactics by the other side. The one case where we were delayed in the trial, not the indictment, but we brought a case against Chris Collins, who was the Trump's earliest backer in Congress. It was an insider trading case. He was a Republican congressman from upstate New York.
Right.
And we brought the indictment, 60 days, right? The 60-day rule. You got to bring an indictment, outside of 60 days before an election.
Now, is that a rule? Is that like a baseball rule where they're like, you can't steal a base when it's 10-0?
There's no crying in baseball. No.
Right. I mean, is that a real rule?
It's not a written rule. It's a rule of thumb. It's been around for a long time. And in the Chris Collins case, we indicted him, and it was a pretty strong case. He won re-election. He then had to resign into his next term because he pled guilty and admitted to his crimes. But he, I think, had the legal ability to appeal that to the Supreme Court and delay his trial. So that's an example of someone who's wealthy and powerful being able to delay the case.
But think of the exceptional effort that you have to make there. Like, I'm just imagining, like, let's say, somebody hits me on a felony drug charge, and I'm like, wait, it's 60 days before the start of football season. Where's my 60-day rule? When you look at these unwritten rules that regular people can't get, that all these avenues, like, I'm not convinced, and I know maybe you can't say it, but I'm not convinced that you don't think Trump was guilty in the Michael Cohen case. I'm not convinced that you don't think he's not guilty in the Weisselberg case. It's that the bar of prosecution, of getting all the evidence together against people that, have the means to delay it, is so high.
And also, it is true that powerful people of means, have potential influence over other witnesses that the normal Joe on the street won't have.
Right.
And that's true. And you've got to push through that.
These sound like mafia cases. I mean, for God's sakes, the prosecutions of politicians really do bear a tremendous resemblance to the prosecution of mob bosses. I mean, Donald Trump is out there right now saying, boy, if you come after me, streets are going to run red, and I'm not going to. Imagine a gang leader says, if you prosecute me, I will have my gang members do that. Most prosecutors would just go, pardon the language, fuck you. I'm taking you down. How much in the behind the scenes, how much conversation is there to the political and social ramifications of these kinds of prosecutions? And how much conversation is there about the frustration of all these really dedicated and amazing attorneys swimming upstream against all the difficulties of fairly prosecuting these cases?
Well, it can sometimes get frustrating for the AUSAs. They work so hard, and it's a team effort there. Mm-hmm. So if someone gets hit with 100 pages of pretrial motions, when I was an AUSA, we always used to chip in and help write the responses, and the same thing goes on today. So the frustration felt is minimized because of the teamwork of the place, and the esprit de corps, which is really, quite incredible.
How do you keep the morale up in these types of cases where the delay is so difficult and the access to information so fraught?
Well, that's, a daily effort by the unit chiefs, of the people who are investigating, to talk about different avenues. So if you're stymied temporarily getting information from one avenue, what about another avenue? Let's do something maybe a little more creative. And so we're always thinking about the angles, about how to get the evidence, because ultimately it's all about the evidence. and the law, but we've got to get that evidence to be able to judge whether to bring a case.
Now, it's got to be. Let's talk about your situation in particular. So you're a guy, you're fighting the good fight there, and Bill Barr, who is the Attorney General of the United States at the time, I believe, when you were at the SDNY, is leaning on you.
Leaning is a polite way of putting it.
A polite way of putting it. Threatening you to use the SDNY to Trump's advantage.
That's absolutely correct.
And how unusual is that? Because what it says to me is, he wanted you to investigate John Kerry. He wanted you to lay off of Michael Cohen. They want all these things. It certainly can't be the first time. It leads me to believe, generally it's like a roach. When you see a roach, you don't think, oh, there's one.
Well, I'll tell you something, John. It was the things that happened to me when I was at the Southern District, the political interference by Main Justice into our cases was unprecedented. Right. We'd have people in the office for 40 years. No one had ever seen anything like it.
Really?
But did that interference occur in other offices while it was happening at the Southern District of New York? I don't doubt that for 1 minute. When Barr tried to get me to resign by dangling some jobs in front of me and trying to put one of, his an outsider who he trusted in charge of the Southern District, I said no. But a few months earlier, he did the same thing in the District of Columbia. And, the U.S. attorney took another job at Treasury, and Barr put in a very close ally. And then it was basically a hostile takeover of the District of Columbia U.S. Attorney's Office by Main Justice. And they've made motions in various cases, including Roger Stone and Manafort, and it was an absolute disgrace. So we know it happened elsewhere. I don't think we know everywhere where it happened because, present and former Department of Justice employees are bound, not to disclose conversations with other DOJ employees, not to disclose cases and investigations.
Right.
The only way I was able to come out with this book is because I went through the pre-publication review process at the Department of Justice. But if somebody doesn't go through that process,
they can't.
They're not permitted to divulge this.
I was raised during Watergate, as you know, we came up during Watergate, and there's not a moment of anything that you described that makes me not think of John Mitchell and Richard Nixon firing Mitchell and getting the FBI and obstruction of justice. How is any of this legal in a democratic system? And how do we bring some form of accountability? Because to my mind, if somebody sees what happens to you, right, and you're able to speak about it now, but if I'm working now in the SDNY or I've got some ambition to rise up through the ranks, I'm looking at these examples and saying, I better keep my nose clean and I better do what's right along these people of power, or I'm not going to be able to get there. And it really undercuts what you think about the fairness of justice.
No, it's absolutely right. And, after Watergate, people in the Department of Justice, the leaders, went to jail. And many thought that lesson would be learned by people coming after them. And I think to a large part, it was. I think this is the first instance since that Watergate period where the Justice Department was politicized to the extent it was. And that's why I thought it was so important to come out with the book to let people understand the full scope of what happened so that, hopefully something like this will be less likely to happen again. Although if we have the same characters, in office, there's no stopping them.
Now, what are you hearing from those that are behind the scenes for all these? You come out with a book. By the way, the book is called Holding the Line Inside the Nation's Preeminent U.S. Attorney's Office and Its Battle with the Trump Justice Department. Do they give any indication to you that now there's a different administration? Have they reassured you that accountability is coming in some way? Or is all this going to be, again, another tempest in a teapot, that we're going to see a raid and a subpoena and a thing, and accountability is put off because there's a 150-day rule before a rally, and there's another, are you hearing anything that gives you confidence that accountability is coming?
Once you leave the Department of Justice, the door shuts, and it's...
Well, they're like the Avengers? You can't even get back in?
That's a great analogy.
All right.
And so I can't get back in, and really the information that you would have if you were in the office is really no longer available. I never ask people for information, and they never provide it because we follow the rules.
Here's the terrible part. They're not.
Well,
and because they're not, in the same way that finally to get their way through the mafia, they had to use the RICO Act and they had to do other things of conspiracy. At some point, somebody's going to have to stand trial, it seems.
Well, we'll see what happens. Look, the Congress, the Senate Committee of the Judiciary has initiated an investigation based on what I have in the book.
Yeah.
So, I welcome that.
Did they not have that information prior?
I don't think they did. No one had. I was prohibited from disclosing it until there was a pre-publication review from the Department of Justice. So they have the information now. They've initiated an investigation. I welcome it, and I'm going to cooperate, obviously, fully with it. And that's going to hopefully help shed more light on the conduct of Trump's Justice Department.
How do we bring white collar and political crime more in line with the way that other people are prosecuted? Because it does seem like, look, after 9/11, law enforcement infiltrated mosques. After the January 6th committee apparently discovered all kinds of things that the Justice Department was like, I never heard that. Can you send that over? Can you copy that memo? How do we bring the two tiers of justice closer together? Unless you believe that they are closer together. But it seems pretty clear to me that we have one sort of set of rules for the powerful and one set of rules for everyone else.
Well, as I've been saying, I don't think that applies in the Southern District of New York because the units that we have that address like serious white-collar crimes, serious public corruption, financial crime, they're the highest levels units in the office and attract the best prosecutors. So we make it a mission to treat those cases, give them the attention that they deserve. And I think, one thing that other, U.S. Attorney's Office might think about is beefing up those units in their offices. So if their white-collar unit has 10 AUSAs, throw in another 5 or 10 people and have them be more entrepreneurial about finding the cases. So,
that's interesting.
When Trump said, I'm canceling the government's subscriptions to the New York Times and the Washington Post, I increased our budget for newspapers in the office because it's reading those newspapers that give our AUSA leads to pursue this kind of public corruption and financial crime.
Do you think it's because, I wonder if it's this, because right now in New York City, there is an enormous hullabaloo about the increase in crime. Is it that people don't view political and white-collar crime? People don't want chaos, and people view their own personal safety different than what these incredible corruption cases may do to the fabric of society. It's not an immediate chaos. And do you think that that plays into why white-collar and political crime is so much more difficult? Because the public outcry is also not really there.
Well, it is true that, the first order of business in a city is to keep people safe, and people want to be kept safe. And so, and now you're really talking about the DA's office, right? You're not talking about the U.S. Attorney's Office, which addresses higher level, more significant cases. So, I can understand that the NYPD and the mayor, want to make people feel and be safe in the city.
Right.
But I can tell you from my experience, when we would bring like a big public corruption case, or we would, that got a lot of attention. I mean,
Right.
the
Well, certainly
citizens
something like Madoff
hate-
and things like that.
They hate people getting paid off. They hate people being given special privileges. And we brought a lot of those cases.
Right.
It's once removed from the safety issue, but
Right.
I think people still think it's
And they
very
can
important.
understand that it can hollow out the fabric of society. It can cause chaos in that, like, it's a loss of resources. It's a loss of trust. What for you now, do you feel like you've blown up your career? Like, how do you, you did this at a high personal risk. You could have done what Bill Barr asked. You could have just accepted the other position and kept your mouth shut and gone along to get along. How does that personal toll and professional toll sit with you now? And do you still stand by your decision? And
John, it never was a decision for me. I had first and foremost, the only thing I cared about during my entire tenure at the Southern District was protecting the integrity and independence of the Southern District. Every decision I made was looked at through that lens. So when I was dangled these other jobs by Bill Barr, it was an absurdity. I mean, to me,
Right.
It was an absurdity, and it would never have happened. And so the book and my decision to throw a light on this was an obligation that came out of my love for the Southern District of New York and my love for the Department of Justice. And I'm hoping that it'll help reestablish the rule of law and cause the Department of Justice to become independent and unbiased, which the country desperately needs.
Was there any thought when all this happened, any talk in the office, sitting by the microwave, making that cup of noodles, hey man, let's all walk out. Let's all, in protest, let's all do that. Captain, my captain. Let's stand up on the desk and let Bill Barr know that we won't take this. Would that be the kind of gesture that would expose this if everyone had just said, you know what? We're walking out. I mean, he said you resigned. Clearly you didn't. But what if everybody had just stood in protest and said, not doing this?
Well, walking out, quitting is exactly what they wanted me to do, because
Right.
that would have opened the opportunity for Barr to appoint someone from the outside
Right.
who he trusted to take over the office. So that was never something that I felt comfortable doing, and never something that would have been appropriate. So like many who stayed in their positions despite misgivings, I took the appointment and I decided to fight to stay in the appointment because I thought it was best for the Southern District of New York and the country, and because the AUSAs who didn't quit, they needed somebody to lead the office.
Do you see this as a singular threat from Trump and that manner of doing business, or is this endemic in the political system right now?
I think it was unprecedented with Trump, and that Trump was able to, put people in these positions who were doing his bidding. I mean, when Barr first came in, I was like, great, we're getting an institutionalist, right? We're getting someone from the, George
Right.
H.W. Bush administration. Fantastic.
Right. Well, now he's come out as an institutionalist. Apparently, while he was there, he was doing the bidding, but now Barr has come out, and it turns out he's the hero of this story.
Yeah, okay, all right, give me a second here. When you look at whether people followed their oaths while in the Trump administration, you got to look prior to the November 2020 election. After the election and after Trump lost,
Yes.
people recalibrated what was in their personal interest. And Barr and many with him at that point, after Trump lost, scurried off the ship.
Right.
But before then, Barr was doing the bidding of the president and undermined the rule of law and corrupted the Department of Justice.
Do you believe that there is anything in place that can prevent this from rerunning? That there will be any accountability? Look, we live in a system where you can't vote if you've been convicted of a crime, but you could still be president. You could do it from jail if you wanted to. Do you have any faith that the guardrails that need to be bolstered will be so before this guy comes back and runs roughshod over any of the things that are the tent posts of a solid democratic system?
Yeah, no, it really concerns me because what I've seen is how vulnerable our system is if you have people intent on destroying it. So if you have a president who moves the levers of government for the acquisition and maintenance of power and personal aggrandizement, and you have people in the top of these agencies who are doing his bidding, and they have people, Barr couldn't have done it alone. He had people who were willing to go along with his machinations, even when it meant interfering in the Southern District's cases. When that exists, you could have all the guardrails you want, and ultimately it depends on the integrity and the honesty of the people in the jobs. And so the only thing I would suggest is that, the Senate in the confirmation process be extra vigilant to ensure that the people who are appointed as U.S. attorneys in the various offices and at the Department of Justice are prepared to follow their oaths.
And in some ways, the courage of those in your party to stand, he can't do this without their submission. And in some respects, maybe it's a moment where they have to, not about Republicans and Democrats, it's about having a republic or not.
You're exactly right. I was in a non-political position, and my problems with the Trump administration, with Bill Barr, are non-political. It's about the destruction of the rule of law, and both parties, both sides of the aisle, should be able to agree upon that. And I'm hoping, and I have faith that leadership will emerge in the Republican Party that respects the rule of law and seeks to restore confidence and faith in all of our critical institutions.
Thank you so much, Geoffrey. Such a pleasure to catch up with you again. It's been many, many years. I do want to thank you. Your family on Halloween always delivered. There were, I don't want to say anything about, you know what the Bartolinos were up to. You could get an apple, for God's sakes, or like somebody would throw a couple of pennies in your bag.
That's exactly right.
But let me tell you something. You guys always delivered.
We gave you the full bar, not those little Halloween bars.
Just know this. It was not in vain, and we were much appreciative.
We held the line on Halloween.
No, I don't think there's any question about that. Geoffrey Berman, the author of Holding the Line, Inside the Nation's Preeminent U.S. Attorney's Office and its Battle with the Trump Justice Department. Please give my best to your family. And
ours, yours.
Thank you so much, and lovely to see you.